You got there? Can anybody hear me yet?
I can hear you.
Oh,
Yes.
bless you. Hallelujah. Okay, fantastic. So let me go through these slides real quick. Good morning, everybody. We are joined by the public as well. And so for those of you from the public who are calling in, there is a link on the bottom of the screen, or there should be, that says public comment form, and it has the link to that. So that is somewhere that you can go if during this meeting you have a question or comment that you would like to be returned to the members. So just as a couple of items here, we do have a tendency every once in a while to get some feedback if multiple people have their mics open at the same time. And so that this is just a reminder that if we can try and mute our mics in between folks talking, and especially during presentations, we can minimize that feedback. There is a U shape with an arrow up that allows you to share your screen. Most of the presenters have practiced that with me and are very well capable of getting that done today. And I appreciate your patience as we resolve technical difficulties throughout the meeting. Just a reminder as well that there was some statute that went out that was amended regarding e-meetings and those being public. And so those requirements are that if you are not being videoed, then you have to say your name before every vote, before every motion, before every amendment, and prior to deliberations. So if you do not have your video activated, then you will need to keep saying your name and then your vote if those things come up. If you do have your video activated, you are not required to do that. And so everyone, thank you so much for coming. There is the first item on the agenda, which I will hand off to the chairs, is the approval of the minutes.
Okay, thank you, Kim. I want to welcome everybody, first of all, to our May 15th meeting. I appreciate everybody's effort to attend today. This is a different effort and a special effort, I guess. But as we were talking before, I hope we don't have to get used to this. This is not the best way to meet folks. You want to meet in person, of course. First of all, we do have our meeting minutes, and I hope everybody got their email with the minutes. And if everyone would take a minute and review those minutes one last time and see if there's any changes or any amendments that need to be made by that.
This is Jay Corpening. I move the minutes be approved.
Okay, we have a motion to approve the minutes.
Carol McManus seconds that motion.
Carol seconds the motion. Okay, Kim, am I supposed to take a poll on these minutes like we do the other things, the other agenda items?
Yes, sir. It will need to be a roll call down the list.
Okay. And you want me to do that?
I'd be happy to if you would like me to.
If you would, that would be great.
Fantastic. So, Ms. Budd? Okay, we'll pin on Ms. Budd. Darren Campbell?
I am here.
Are you voting in favor to approve the minutes?
Oh, sorry, I says yes, absolutely. Sorry.
Fantastic. Judge Corkman?
Yes.
Bill D. Davis,
Yes.
Gary Frank,
Yes.
Beth Freshwater Smith,
Yes.
Michelle Hall, Krista Hyatt,
Mr. Hyatt votes yes.
Ruby Brown Herring,
Yes.
Jennifer Knox,
Yes.
Billy Lassiter,
Yes.
Jeffrey Ledford, Kim Martin,
Yes.
Martin McGee, Carol McManus,
Yes.
Mary Stansel,
Yes.
Heather Taraska.
Yes.
Heather, I'm so glad you could get in.
Me too.
Eric Zagra,
Yes.
Latoya Powell.
Yes.
Thank you. You've completed your roll call.
Okay, thank you, Kim, and that does give us a quorum, right?
Yes, sir.
Okay. Well, thanks, everyone. Thank you for that vote. The next item on our agenda is the RTA data update and the juvenile justice needs, and I believe Deputy Secretary Lassiter has that for us.
And thank you, everyone, for joining today. We appreciate your attendance at the meeting today, and I'll jump right into it and go over several things that and where we are as far as the data on Raise the Age so far. And feel free, if you've got questions, to either stop me while we're going, or I'll take the questions at the end. Either way is fine with me. So a couple of things that we want from you, I'm just prompting you now, and then we can vote on these at the end, is that as we talked about it at the January meeting, that we did an interim report that was required by statute. We did submit that report, which you all approved. At that time, we said that we wanted more time to look at what the Raise the Age data looked like before we submitted a final report to the General Assembly for this session. Of course, that was pre-COVID-19 and pre the craziness that has ensued afterwards. And so we're trying to figure all that out. And the data is kind of reflective of what we've seen with the pandemic, and I'll get into that in a few minutes. So I'm not sure that we still have the complete picture of what Raise the Age will mean because of the data changing a little bit because of the pandemic. But in the meantime, we are going to still submit to the General Assembly what some of the needs are that we've gotten from you guys as partner agencies and from us. As you know, in January, you already approved a couple of the resource needs for JJ. We have one additional need that we're going to put in the report that we would like for you guys to approve. I'll go over that during my presentation. There's also a request that's come in from AOC. This was the Administrative Office of the Courts. These resources were things that we had talked about at the last meeting and reflective of the RTA population that's coming in. I know AOC's worked with Judge Rader and some of you all on developing what those needs are, and so they will present later in the meeting today. And then finally, we'll also talk about Eric has one more need that he would like to ask for support for from the Juvenile Defender's Office, and so we will have him present later in the agenda. And at the end, what we're going to ask for is for you guys just to authorize the department to write a report that goes over all the recommendations that you guys vote on today. In addition to that, I know Heather's group, Heather Taraska's group, has worked on identifying what are some of the legislative changes that are needed. We haven't gotten deep into that yet, but we have identified the needs that are there as far as additional legislative changes that are needed. And so we'll highlight what that committee is working on. The other two subcommittees, we have the minimum age subcommittee that's met once, but we haven't gotten very deep into that either. And because of COVID-19, we haven't really been able to meet. And same thing is true with the housing committee. Neither one of those two committees have met anymore. And so I don't know that there's a whole lot to put in this report about those two things. So we're just going to highlight the things that Heather's committee's worked on so far. And that's really just coming up with what the priorities should be. Okay, so I'm going to start out with just going over a couple of things that we have done for COVID-19 and the juvenile justice system. I think these are important for you all to know. And again, obviously, COVID-19 has affected the numbers that have been coming in from Raise the Age. And so I do want to walk you through a couple of the things that we've done. And one of the big things that we started out with was that we wanted to reduce the population both in detention and YDCs to make sure that we had room to do social distancing within the facilities. Our bigger fear in this was detention, because in detention, as you all know, kids come directly off the street from law enforcement into a detention center with us having little to no background on what's going on with that child before they walk in the door. And so to try to stop the spread of COVID-19 into one of our facilities, and we've been very successful so far. We have 0 cases in the juvenile justice system, so we're really excited about that and proud of that, and but also know that there may be the chance in the future that it could come into our facilities. We wanted to allow for that social distancing, and the best way for us to do that was to try to reduce some of our population. So we did work with our judges across the state and with our court counselors to try to identify kids that we could remove from the detention system and put on electronic monitoring while they were awaiting trial. And so we have been very successful in doing that. We've reduced the population in our detention centers by about 27% statewide. And in response to that, we've also seen an increase in the number of kids that are on electronic monitoring. That's increased by almost 22%. And so these kids are still being monitored. They're still being looked after by our court staff across the state, but we were able to get them out of our facilities to allow for more social distancing to occur. We've also released kids from YDCs, our youth development centers, 33 juveniles from there, and that was really looking at the kids that had their time already in, essentially in the system, and were facing nonviolent offenses that we felt like it was time to go ahead and move them to the community. A lot of these kids have moved to step-down programs in our communities. Things like Eckerd and our transitional homes have been willing to take these kids in, and we're extremely, extremely thankful of our community partners that were willing to work with us and stay open during this pandemic and take in a lot of these juveniles so that they could step down from a youth development center. We started courts, and this is something that I know this committee's been talking about for a while. We're really excited that we've gotten that off the ground in the state of North Carolina with juveniles across the state. So every juvenile detention facility in our state is now capable of doing e-courts and doing the secure custody hearings with the courts. We sent out 100 laptops across the system and sent one to each of our juvenile detention centers and also to our court staff so that we could do those e-court hearings. And had quite a few of those across the state very successfully. There are some jurisdictions where the judges still have not allowed for those to occur in their jurisdictions, but in most places across the state, e-courts is up and going. And this is a huge factor in helping us, because one of the things that happens is that a kid has to go to court. When they come back, often we're having to quarantine them and keep them isolated from the other juveniles in the facility for up to 14 days. A lot of times that period is 7 days, but it can be up to 14 days. So by doing e-courts, we allow that kid not to have to go back into that quarantine status. And so it really saves the kid a lot of by allowing them to stay involved in programming, but it also allows us not to have to transport those kids out of the facilities. We've increased telehealth by putting that in each of our facilities also. By putting the new telecommunication stuff that we've put into our facilities has allowed us to do mental health and physical health appointments in our facilities. And so that's a real benefit that has come out of this whole thing. We do staff screening every day. Staff are screened as they come into the facility. We do temperature checks, and we ask additional questions to make sure that they're not showing any symptoms before they can come into the facility. All non-essential volunteers and contractors are not allowed in the facilities right now to limit the amount of possibility of the virus coming into our facilities. We have medical room confinement for kids that are first brought into juvenile detention centers. And as I said, that can be up to 14 days. We try to limit it if at all possible. And we've also bought tablets for those juveniles that are in isolation so they can continue with their schoolwork. So those tablets have been purchased and are being distributed in our facilities right now. And we really wanted to make sure that the juveniles still had an opportunity to be involved in as much programming as possible while they were in that medical room confinement. So we screen all juveniles also before they're transported and before they're released. And when they are released, we send a packet with them about things that they can do to make sure that they don't catch coronavirus in the future, but also all their records in case they're transferring to another location are sent with them so they don't have to go into medical room confinement once they're moved to another facility, because we can track the last 14 days that they were with us. So no visitors except for attorneys. We still are allowing attorneys into the detention facilities. They can also do their attorney visits with their juveniles in confidence. Their confidential time that is set up before each court hearing through e-courts also, if the juveniles attorneys want to do that. But we're also allowing them to still continue to come into the facilities. They are screened just like any other visitors, but we are allowing that to occur. We suspended home visits temporarily with our court staff. We're looking at safe ways to resume that the 1st of June, but we are allowing electronic monitoring to continue. Our contractors are going out and doing those electronic monitoring hookups with our juveniles, so either at the courthouse or at the kid's home, and so we are continuing to do those. And like I said, we're going to restart home visits hopefully the 1st of June with extra PPE. Personal protective gear that we can give to our staff. We didn't have that when we first put this in place, and so it was really important until we had that equipment that we cut back on those home visits. We increased the numbers of juveniles phone calls that they can make to families. Since we weren't allowing visitation with their families, we wanted to make sure that kids had the opportunity to do phone calls with their parents and with their family members, so we've increased those greatly in our facilities. And we've also started video visitation for the first time in our facilities. Those are just starting across our system to allow for families to visit with their kids through video conferencing also. We're rescheduling non-critical medical appointments so that kids don't have to leave the facilities, and handling a lot of those appointments through telehealth now. And so those are in place. And we've hired additional medical personnel, our nurses across the state. And each of our detention facilities now has medical personnel that is available and working with the kids on how they can make sure they can maintain that social distance, how they can maintain sanitary practices in the facilities so we don't have any spread of coronavirus in those facilities. And that's been a huge help to our staff. So now let's walk into where are we as far as what the numbers are showing us with RTA and how has coronavirus kind of affected that in the population. So you've got 3 different lines here that kind of show you the detention center population. The blue line shows you what the detention center population looked like in 2019. The orangish red line there shows you the population as of 2020. And then the DC population that we projected would come into the system is that gray line at the top. And so you can see in the marked time period right before coronavirus hit, that red line and that gray line are pretty close together. What we were projecting would come into the system and what we were actually seeing come into the system were almost on the same line there. But after the coronavirus hit and we tried to reduce the population, working with law enforcement, working with our judges across the state, you can see that red line is now back down near where we were last year. And so the population in our detention centers is at that same level. And again, that was intentional, how we set those things up by doing the electronic monitoring. So again, I think it's hard to get a clear picture, a total clear picture yet about what that population will look like once this pandemic has passed. But we have a couple of weeks there that you can see what it looked like right before the pandemic hit and Raise the Age had really started to kick into gear. And it looks like we were pretty close to what the projection was going to be in that time period. The next chart that you see here, this is overall complaints coming into the system. And so you've got 3 different lines and bars here also. The orange bar is what the non-RTA population, so the non-Raise the Age population that has come into the system looks like. The gray bar shows you the raise the age population that we've had come into the system. And then the blue line shows you what the population was, how many complaints we had coming into the system last year. And so you can see that we kind of started out there in the beginning. The blue and the orange line kind of met up pretty closely, except in that first week. So that blue line shows you kind of, if it's at the top of the orange line, then that will be exactly kind of the same population coming into the system as we saw the year before. The gray lines add that additional RTA population. So you can see when the coronavirus really started to kick in mid-March there, we actually dropped below, even with the raised the age population and the non-raised the age population combined for about 3 weeks there. We actually dropped completely below what the total population was last year coming into the system. So we had a 3-week period there where it really dropped. As you can see, it's kind of started to level back out again. That blue line is kind of hitting at the top of those orange lines in 2 of the last 4 weeks. But again, in the last 2 weeks, we're seeing that blue line is at the top of the gray bar also. So not a huge increase in the last month and a half here as far as the population. But before coronavirus hit, we were seeing exactly pretty much what we were projecting, and I'll show you that in a few minutes. Obviously, with school being out, one of our big populations has dropped. And so the light blue line here shows you school-based offenses last year. The dark blue line shows you school-based offenses this year. So obviously, with school being out, there have been very few school-based offenses since the coronavirus occurred. You may wonder, why is that little peak there in the April 22nd time period? That was because we had a group of students that went and although they were out of school, they were missing school so much, they decided to go trespass on school campus and do some damage. And that's why those complaints have come in. They actually did occur on school campuses, so we still consider them school-based offenses. But in general, you can see that we've had none of those, and that could account for why we're seeing a reduction in the overall complaints coming into the juvenile justice system. Since school-based offenses account for about 45% of all complaints coming into the system, when you don't have those, obviously the population is going to drop. The other thing I wanted to show you was that, typically in the juvenile justice system, serious and violent offenses only account for about 3% of the population. With Raise the Age, we've seen that increase slightly. So the red bar down there at the bottom shows you the violent offenses, those A through E offenses. The yellow bars there show you the serious offenses, those felonies, the low-level felonies, and then the green are those misdemeanor offenses that occur. So you can see that since the coronavirus has taken place, we've actually seen the serious and violent offenses make up a larger proportion of the total offenses coming into the system. And I think what explains that is that those are offenses that nobody's willing to divert, or law enforcement is going to still charge on, even in the middle of a pandemic. If you have an A through E, we're still going to get that complaint coming in. And because the lower level offenses, law enforcement and court counselors are diverting a lot of those cases, you're seeing that less of the population coming into the system. I think the trend will eventually balance back out, where we're seeing 4 to 5% of the total population will be those more violent and serious offenses. But right now, you can see that with more discretion being involved during the pandemic, that that makes up a smaller percentage. I mean, the serious and violent offenses make up a larger percentage of the overall complaints, but the total number of complaints have gone down. So just wanted to point that out to you so you can kind of see what we're dealing with. So overall, what are some of the trends that we've seen? There's been a 30% reduction in status offenses received from this calendar year based off of last year's calendar year. And so that's down from 1,100 down to 800 this year. So status offenses could always be charged for kids all the way up to age 18. So Raise the Age really didn't affect status offenses, but you can see that those numbers have dropped. Don't know if that's coronavirus related or if that's just because there's been more focus on those other incidents that occurred, those more violent offenses in the system. So we'll see if that trend continues moving forward after coronavirus is over. 21% increase in distinct juveniles on electronic monitoring. Talked about that earlier. That's because we've made a real effort to try to get some of those kids out of detention that we can. that are especially facing nonviolent offenses in the community, and keep them on electronic monitoring. So we have greatly increased the amount of electronic monitoring across the state, and that's been very successful of trying to reduce that detention population, at least for the meantime, so that we can have that social distancing in our facilities. Since December 1st, there has been a 48% increase in delinquent complaints. And so even with coronavirus in place, you may remember that we were projecting that there would be a 63% increase in the juvenile population overall. And so since December 1st, we're at 48%. So not real far away from what the projection was. And the couple of months before coronavirus hit, we were slightly above the projection of that 63%. Now we have dropped back down below that projection at 48%. And so you all have seen this chart many a times, and so I won't spend a whole lot of time on it, but this is what we were projecting all along, and basically just so you can remember, we were basing those projections off the AOC charge data that was in the system, adult correction data that we had in the system, and basing those projections off of that, and that's what we're comparing these projections overall on. So this slide has a lot of data on it. I won't go for every bit of it. If you've got some individual questions about it afterwards, I'll be glad to answer some of those questions. But you can see kind of what the trend looks like by month as far as what we thought we were projecting would happen in those months and what has actually happened. And so you can see in January and February, we were very close to the projections, and then we dropped off greatly in March and April. And that was also true in December. December was only 24% of what we projected overall as the number of complaints. And so, again, what is the real trend line going to look like once coronavirus is over? That's a good question. Will it be more like January and February where we were close to the projection, or will it be more like March and April where we were only about half of what the projection is? So these percentages are the percent of the projected amount of population we expected to come into the system. This isn't the amount of increase. This is how much it compares to the actual projections that we were making. So if you see 78% or 91% in that on that first line there, that's 91% of that 63% increase we were expecting. And so you can kind of see the categories that are still high or dead on pretty much what we were projecting are those A through G complaints. So those have not gone down. They have not decreased below what we projected them to be. And you can see, in fact, in April, we were dead on. Exactly what we projected came into the system as far as complaints. And so that where we've seen the decrease is in those H felonies through the misdemeanor threes. And you can see that in that next line down. So about a half of what we were projecting coming into the system for those in the last couple of months there. The other thing that I'll draw your attention to, because it's one of the things that we made a request for additional resources in, was in the detention population. And that detention population, as you can see in the second to last line there, has been just about dead on what we were projecting. You can see the number of complaints coming in and the number of actual juveniles that are coming into the system. As far as those A through Gs, that population stays a lot longer, and we'll talk about that in just a second. This shows you the RTA complaints overall by district. So you can pull out your individual district here and see the blue line there shows you what we projected would come in. The yellow line shows you what has actually come into the system. And so you can compare what we were projecting for your particular district and what has actually come in. If you are interested in individual monthly data, we can get that for you. This is December 1st through April 30th. And so this is a dashboard that we created to kind of track what we expected to come into the system and what was coming into the system. You can also see the breakdown of how those cases were handled, where they approved, diverted, or closed. And you can see that in the pie charts below. This shows you the actual distinct number of juveniles. So the last one was complaints. This is the actual kids. So again, we're still seeing on average that kids are coming in with about 2 complaints. And so the complaint number is always going to be higher than the actual number of juveniles. And so this shows you the actual number of juveniles that have come into the system. And again, you've got the comparison between the projection and what is actually come into the system. So let's look at some of the overall trends that we've seen and some of the things that we can highlight that we know from this new raise the age population. Number one, they're more risky. On average, their risk level is risk level 4. The average kid that comes into the juvenile justice system is risk level 3. So they are on the higher end of the risk spectrum of the kids that are coming in, but it is a little bit different population in that regard. And that's why we think we're seeing more of them end up in detention, because they're having higher risk scores, which would indicate that in a lot of those cases that they may need detention services. Fewer overall complaints in juveniles than projected. Again, that could be 2 factors. One, just starting in December, we didn't see as many as we were expecting, and then in March and April, because of the coronavirus, we saw some reductions in those complaints coming in. More A through G youth than projected. So we've had more of the A through G youth come into the system. 100% of the projected complaints have been received in that category. So we've almost dead on as far as the number of complaints, but the number of kids has been slightly higher. Most common complaint for the A through G population is a Class D, robbery with a dangerous weapon. We've had 141 of those complaints that have come in. So when we're looking at that A through G category, that Class D, robbery with a dangerous weapon is the top one that we're seeing. More detention omissions for that greater than or equal to 16-year-old population group for the A through Gs, and compared to the projections. And the early numbers indicate a greater number of closed and diverted cases for the population than was projected originally. So we are seeing more cases, some of those complaints being closed and diverted than we were originally projecting. We're not sure if that's just people getting accustomed to the system, and some of those complaints are because they haven't really done 16 or 17-year-old juvenile complaints before. They're just getting used to doing those complaints correctly, and that might be why some of those have just been closed, because there wasn't sufficient evidence, or there wasn't the material that we needed to proceed with those cases. So this is where I was talking about the average length of stay. If you're looking at a juvenile under juvenile jurisdiction in our detention facilities, they're on average only staying in a detention facility for 21 days. Those kids that are being transferred to adult jurisdiction and are staying in juvenile detention, they're staying on average 250 days. And so that's a huge difference. And so because we're seeing that A through G population meet the projection or be slightly higher than the projection, those are the kids that stay a long time also. So it not only affects the number of admissions coming into the system, it affects the overall length of stay of kids in the system in our detention facilities. And so typically that 250 days is while that child is awaiting adjudication in the adult system. So they're waiting for a guilty or innocent conviction, and then also a disposition in the adult system. And that's why that 250 days is so lengthy, because they're waiting for that trial to occur. So we're not transferring them to the adult system until the actual conviction occurs. Although we've seen a greater number of those A through G or A through E complaints coming into the system, we haven't seen a huge increase in detention population for the under 16-year-old population. So the orange bar here shows you the under 16-year-old population. So last year, when you're looking at this data, there were only under 16-year-olds. And so you're only going to see the orange bar in the first one in each of these charts. And then the yellow bar shows you the additional population that has come in because of raise the age. And so as far as detention admissions overall, we're only slightly higher because the overall under 16-year-old population has dropped significantly in detention. But when you add the new raise the age population, it tops off that admission population slightly. Same thing with commitments. They're slightly down, but I think that's greatly due to the fact that we haven't had a lot of court in the state of North Carolina over the last 2 months. So we have a lot of kids that are pending in detention that are awaiting that final adjudication and disposition hearing to determine whether they're going to go to YDC. So our overall commitments are actually down for the year so far. Even when you combine the raise the age population on top of it, they're still down for the year. And just to highlight again, I know you all have seen this budget comparison a number of times before. what the actual compromise budget was. This was House Bill 1001 that passed last year that the governor signed, and you can see the resources there that were allotted last year. And for the most part, most of these resources have been put out in the community. We've had a difficult time getting some of those things started in this time of a pandemic, but we're really excited to tell you that just this week, we started a brand new transitional home in Forsyth County for this older population that will be leaving youth development centers. That opened this week on Monday, and the first kid arrived on Tuesday. And so we were able to get him out of a YDC and into a transitional facility and starting on his transition into adulthood by getting him a job and getting him into community college. Both of those things are happening. They're helping him get enrolled and figure out how to do that in the fall. So really excited that we've been able to start a new transitional facility there. We're looking at several enhancements to our current residential contracts. We have several that are already back in for bid that we're getting ready to award across the state that will increase our residential population across the state. So we're really excited. And our vendors that have worked with us, Eckerd and WestCare and Methodist Home for Children, have been incredible during this pandemic. Their staff has stuck with us and stayed on and really helped us make sure that we could have alternatives for these kids instead of putting them in detention in these multi-purpose group homes and other facilities across the state. So we asked the Sentencing Commission, and I know Michelle's on the call, and Michelle, feel free to pipe in if you want to add any to the conversation here. But one of the things that we've looked at, you guys may remember in the technical correction bill that was proposed for the passage of the budget last year, there was some language that would basically get all kids under the age of 18 moved to the juvenile justice system into a juvenile detention facility. So even if they were once an adult, always an adult, even if they were a kid that was facing a motor vehicle violation that would end up with them being in jail, they would still be housed in a juvenile detention center. This is so that we could have the full sight and sound separation that's required by the federal law that goes in effect in 2 more years. And so this was a proposal that was put forward by the General Assembly at the very end of the session last year. It passed the House, but it still is pending in the Senate. So we went ahead and asked Michelle's group at the Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission to put together what that would look like as far as additional beds. And you can see it's not a huge increase. And so we're glad to see that that's the case. Again, if you've got some questions, I know Michelle's on the call, and we'll be glad to answer any questions you might have about that. So let's look at what that means as far as detention. In the January proposal, we did request an additional $6 million, and that was because that was not fully funded in our original request for detention. And so that request has already been made to the General Assembly and to the governor. And you know, with everything that's going on with COVID-19 right now, we're not exactly sure what the budget's going to look like. So I don't know if that request will be funded or not, just because the resources have gotten very tight very quickly. As you are aware, the revenue has dropped greatly coming into the system because of reductions in sales tax and income tax, with people being unemployed and with fewer things being purchased out in the communities. And the other thing that makes the picture unclear right now is that tax collections for income taxes has been delayed until July 15th. And so we won't have a full picture of what the revenue looks like for the year until that July 15th collection is done. And so we're hoping that this will be part of the consideration that the General Assembly will make moving forward, because if that population does pop back up after the pandemic, we would certainly need those additional beds in detention based off of what we saw in January and February. The second point there is that additional population that would be needed based off of the Sentencing and Policy Advisory Commission's report that you just saw, what we think would be needed to house that additional population that would be coming into the system that were either the once an adults or the motor vehicle violations that needed to be covered. So it's made that additional recommendation. If they pass that legislation, this is what it would cost. And then the third bullet point down there is that, as you all know, we're still working on the Rockingham Youth Development Center. We've had some really good progress, actually, in the interim since the last time we met. We've decided to used the inmate construction program to build the Rockingham Youth Development Center. This is a great development for us because it's going to actually save us about $12 million to do it that way. We've met with Rockingham County and with the city of Reidsville. They're on board and excited about the opportunity for that to happen. So as soon as we can get inmates back in the field working, that process will start. We've already started to purchase all the materials that are needed to build the facility, and we hope to break ground in mid-July on the Rockingham facility. And so once that facility is built, we still need to get the staffing for it, and that will be one last request that we'll have for the General Assembly. So that's kind of where we are in the system right now, some of the data that's out there. I'll be glad to try to take questions from folks. If you have any questions, feel free to ask at this point.
Okay.
Billy.
Does anybody have any questions?
Sounded like Jay had one.
I do. Oh, this is Jay Corpen. Not so much a question as a comment. The remote hearings have been incredible. The convenience, the safety, we're avoiding transporting juveniles. So I hope that you guys will take a look at, continuing that after this is all done, whenever that is. And obviously that'll require some statutory change, but it's also provided really good access for lawyers to their clients. So I've seen it as a win-win.
I agree completely. Thank you, Judge Courtney. Our goal is to extend this after it's over. I think it's been a real positive that has come out of this whole situation. We are purchasing the WebEx communication boards that will be in each of our detention facilities, and they've actually started already arriving. We've been using the laptops in the meantime, but those Spark boards are coming and will be in all of our facilities hopefully by the end of June, which will even provide us more confidentiality. And I think that's what most of the court offices across the state have already in place, and so in their courtrooms. And so this will really make that process much simpler. We did the laptops just as a holdover during the emergency to go ahead and get something in place. But they've gone really well on that equipment. And these Spark boards that we're getting in the facilities will actually upgrade that significantly. So we're really excited about it. It really saves us a lot of resources and time and not having to transport juveniles. But it also allows us to do a lot of other things that we haven't been able to do in the past, like telehealth, telemental health, which is really helpful, especially when we have a kid that is suicidal in one of our detention facilities. Allows them to get seen without having us to take them to the hospital, which is, where coronavirus is, and we don't really want to expose the kid to that. And so it really allows us to get out there and get that telepsychiatry in place. And so we're really excited about not only what it provides to the court, but the other additional services that our kids are going to be able to access now that they had never been able to access in the past. So it's a real win-win for us.
Billy,
Okay, any other questions or comments?
Yes, Billy, this is Ruby Brown Herring. I'm just curious, for the youth that have been released and on electronic monitoring, have they had trouble accessing mental health services to your knowledge in the community?
I know that we've been working with them, Ruby, and I don't know the exact answer to that, so I will get the answer to you, and I'll have Maxine reach out to you from court services and let you know exactly what's going on. We've actually been able to provide some of our juveniles that are leaving the facilities with tablets so that they can continue their education and mental health through those tablets. But I know that the LMEs have been working with us really closely to make sure if we can do telehealth to do that. If not, then try to figure out a way that we can still get those kids mental health services. And I'll give you an exact answer from Maxine. She can give you those details.
Okay, thank you so much. That's very helpful.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Okay, if not, Deputy Secretary, I assume that last slide would be what we would need to vote on.
I think let's hear Eric's presentation and AOC's presentation and let them present, and then we can vote all on them at one time since it takes so long to vote through this process. We can just put it all in one package and vote on it at one time.
Okay. All right, next we have AOC updates and needs. Brad Fowler.
Good morning. So I'm going to try to share my application, and you can let me know if you see. Can you all see the application? Can you see the spreadsheet?
Yes, yes, we can see it, Brad.
Yes.
Okay, great. Great. So the gist of this presentation is we've been talking about resource needs all throughout, and the reality that some pieces of that are unknown, and we'll continue to live and learn through that. But the projections that we used in showing resource needs were ultimately the methodology chosen by the Fiscal Research Division. So in this example, I'm showing you the district court judge one. That methodology said the need would be 5 district court judges. So we all know that there's a variety of strong opinion about whether that's enough, and it may or may not be. So the perspective that we have essentially presented so far in resource discussions from the AOC perspective is that the districts that were already worse off should have priority for additional resources. And one thing that Judge Rader and others expressed is the reality that the volume, if you just look at raw volume of cases that are going to be now juvenile cases, that is higher in the bigger districts. And so we wanted to balance the charts. The information we've already presented as far as rank order need, we update that every year, but that hasn't really changed from our perspective. But there is, and I'm going to use the judgment, I can also show, we've done one for clerks, for ADAs, for prosecutor staff, but they really show the same story. The judge one may be the easiest to understand that at, but I'll just go ahead and show what we've done. And we want to offer this as an additional lens to look through, which is, so I'll just choose Wake as a great example. So you can see in the first column, would be column A, the 3-year average eligible defendants. So when we were projecting, as Billy said, we used our number of 16 and 17-year-olds defendants, and we looked at by highest charge to determine if they were a felon. And ultimately, as the bill progressed, we excluded motor vehicle, and so we began to try to get a lens that looked at potential eligible defendants. And then we applied JJ's. This is before applying any diversion. So, so diversion would reduce the number of court cases potentially, or it might. But anyway, so in Wake County, as you can see, District 10, they're projected to potentially be 1,421 defendants. So when Judge Rader was talking about essentially almost an entire docket every week coming from that, that would not be surprising with these numbers. And you can see District 26, which is Mecklenburg, more toward the bottom here, with potentially 1,871 defendants. And so that is, in the Mecklenburg example, that's 10% of the estimated statewide impact, and Wake is 7.8%. And so what that translates to, and the next 2 columns are just informational. They're the number of judges authorized and the number of judges needed by the current workload formula. So what these columns, these highlighted columns show is if you take the proportion, if you assume, and this is just, again, you can make any methodological assumption you want, but if you assume the Fiscal Research Division need, which is 5 district court judges, and you say, let's just use Wake, what is 7.7% of that? So it'd be Wake's quote unquote share of those 5 judgeships based on their 1,400 defendants. It is 3.9 judges here. We know that there's a variety of opinion about whether case weights are high enough in workload formulas. So we just did a plus or minus 25% just to demonstrate, one, the unknowns of what will actually happen as we go forward, and also just the fact that estimates really should generally have some range reflecting. And so if you get down to District 26, 0.51, again, the range 0.4 to 0.6, which would round, in our rounding rules, that would round to an additional judgeship. So this essentially, hopefully shares a perspective that Judge Rader was showing, which is if you look through the lens of only impact of raise the age, the bigger districts would be the first to come up with a need for a new fill-in-the-blank judge, clerk, ADA. So we're just trying to show that really in a methodological, mathematical way. And we think it balances the information we've already provided, doesn't really replace it in the sense that there are arguments that, the worse off, even though their percent impact is similar across the state, they will feel it because they're already worse off. There's also an argument that says if you're looking at raw new number of cases hitting a docket, then this would be a reflection of that. And so we have charts for each work group with the same approach and methodology. And again, you can fill in, or we can, obviously, we could fill in any number here and it would auto-calculate that perspective. And so we just wanted to offer this additional information and additional perspective as resources are, well, if additional resources get passed out and become available, we want to demonstrate the raw need in addition to the percentage that's already included in the other charts. So I'm happy to take any questions about this.
Does anybody have any questions? Okay, Mr. Fowler, thank you for that information. And we will incorporate that into our motion when it comes time for that. Next, we have Eric Zogry with the North Carolina Juvenile Defenders Organization.
Hello, everyone. Okay, let me see if I can do this correctly. Hold on. I don't know if I can. Okay, how does this look to everybody? Can you see the PowerPoint?
Yes.
Okay. Thanks. All right, so thank you, everyone. This is going to be fairly brief. This is a similar presentation that I made a couple of years ago when we were starting to ask for resources in support of juvenile defense. And the punchline, the end ask will be for a juvenile contracts administrator position, but just a little bit of background on how we got here and why. So as you can see, in 2004, just before our office was created, we only had a handful of services that were, sort of full-time juvenile defense. The blue counties indicate public defender offices. The greenish counties include contracts that existed, and in Guilford County we had a mix. But as you can tell, in the vast majority of the counties, we had no what I would call dedicated defenders. It would be defenders who would be on local indigent lists. Sometimes they would stay on, sometimes they would get off. There were varying amounts of quality and experience. So one of the things we've tried to do over the last 15 years is increase the number of dedicated juvenile defenders in a given county. You all might be aware that unlike some of the other systems in justice broadly or in juvenile justice, is that we don't have one specific indigent defense delivery system. We have this combination. And so now you can see kind of what it looks like today. Again, in this one, the green counties are public defender offices that handle juvenile delinquency cases. The blue counties are contractors, and the gold are both. So you can see from the 2 slides how we're moving closer to getting more experienced, more qualified attorneys in those jurisdictions. And again, we originally asked for an assistant juvenile defender in fiscal year 19, and hold on, I just lost my mouse. As you know, that got done. Thank you very much to this group and the General Assembly. Terry Johnson, who's from Statesville, started actually just at the beginning of COVID on March 16th, and she's been doing very well, even though we haven't been able to meet in person. So we appreciate that. But the second ask also was to have a contracts administrator position. The reason why we didn't ask for that in the last request, and that we're asking for it to start in January of next year, is because in the interim we had received a federal grant that was supplying funds to create a part-time juvenile contracts specialist position. That position will expire with the grant, so we're asking for this additional contracts administrator position to start January of 2021. I also just wanted to go over a few of the reasons why we'd like to enter contracts into these jurisdictions that don't have any. One, we really believe it improves quality because generally there are fewer attorneys getting more cases. They have more incentive to go to training and to become more educated, and it's just a more of a buy-in of becoming a juvenile defender. We feel like it improves court efficiency because you know who the defenders are who are showing up. You know, one of the main goals is that they try to meet their clients as best possible before court, that they're ready to go. They've talked to the court counselors, they've talked to the prosecutors, they're trying to work out their cases. It also enhances accountability because especially with our now sort of 3-piece regional defense, we're able to have, lack of a better word, more authority over contractors because they contract with IDS in our office. And so we're able to, work with them if there's issues. And then, of course, cost control. We're able to gather data and figure out exactly how much it's costing to provide juvenile defense services, which is important information for indigent defense generally. As I mentioned, here's kind of where we're hoping to go with the regionalization, and we've just sort of got started, and there will be more on this to come. But one defender would be in this section. Right now, we're thinking Kim Howes from our office. Terry Johnson, who I mentioned, who's here in Statesville, would cover this area, and then I would cover this area. And that's all I've got. So if anybody has any questions, I'd be glad to take them.
Okay, are there any questions of Mr. Zagri?
If there are no questions, I would move, Chair, that we adopt the recommendations that were presented today by DPS, AOC, and by Mr. Zagri, and allow for DPS to write up a report that you all can approve, but to include all those recommendations in it, and we would get that report to you, and y'all could have a chance to edit it.
Okay. So that would be a motion on the floor.
This is Jay Corpening. I second the motion.
Okay, we have a motion and a second. Is there any further discussion or questions? Okay, hearing none, then we would ask Kim if you could go through the roll call.
Yes, sir. So this is a vote in confirmation of allocated resources, and for DPS, to create a report on the items listed today. Betty Budd,
Yes.
Tara Callahan,
Yes.
Darren Campbell,
Yes.
Judge Courtney,
Yes.
Bill Davis,
Yes.
Gary Frank,
Yes.
Beth Freshwater Smith,
Yes.
Michelle Hall,
Yes.
Krista Hyatt,
Yes.
Ruby Brown Herring,
Yes.
Jennifer Knox,
Yes.
Billy Lassiter,
Yes.
Seth Ledford, Kim Martin,
Yes.
Marty McGee, Mary Stansel,
Yes.
Heather Traska,
Yes.
LaToya Powell,
Yes.
Eric Zagra.
Yes.
Roll call complete.
You skipped Carol McManus, but my vote is yes.
My apologies, Carol. I am so sorry. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Kim, for that. Did we skip anybody else by mistake? Okay, if not, then the motion carries. Thanks, everybody, for your vote. Next, we have the legislative update. Justin Davis with the DPS Legislative Liaison.
Hi, can everyone hear me okay?
Yes.
Okay, great. So good morning. First, I'd like to say that I hope each of you and your families are doing well and staying healthy during these unprecedented times. It's definitely been a interesting time, to say the least. This morning, I'd like to provide a brief update on what's been going on at the General Assembly. As you can imagine, for the past couple of months, it's been a little bit different at the legislature. The legislature has been, focused on COVID-19 and the needs associated with the pandemic. That's really been the sole attention of the legislature lately. For the first time in history, we did see legislative subcommittees meet online remotely for the first time back in March. Coming into some of these coming into the session dealing with COVID, a lot of people had questions so far as how the legislature would conduct their business. Obviously, there are a lot of rules and parameters of how they do business, and so they were able to actually get quite a bit done working around some of the things, thanks to remote technology. The way the House kind of approached things was the House had 4 subcommittees that were formed that focused on economic support, health, education, and continuity of state operations. And each of these subcommittees conducted their business in what I thought was really a very transparent manner, with proceedings streamed live on YouTube. You could always see what was on the agenda. They took public comment. I thought it was a really transparent manner in which they carried out business. Those House subcommittees continue to be active, and even some of them met this week again. So their work is not complete. The Senate, on the other hand, they took really kind of a different approach. They provided little indication of what would be included in their proposal, with details not disclosed until the last week of April. However, fortunately, differences between the House and Senate versions were able to be worked out very quickly, and the relief package was approved and sent to Governor Cooper on May 2nd. That bipartisan $1.57 billion relief package was signed into law by Governor Cooper on May the 4th, 2 days later. Since then, over the past 2 weeks, both the House and Senate have held skeleton sessions where they've met at least once every 3 days. Really the purpose of these meetings is to keep session going without adjourning it. So there is a rule in there where they have to meet every at least 3 days. There have been a handful of non-COVID bills filed during this time, but otherwise it's been fairly quiet over there. In fact, the building up until, from I guess middle of March through what will be Monday, no one from the general public has been allowed in the building. So that's definitely a change. So what's on the horizon for the General Assembly? Well, I think I'd be lying if I said I could tell you with certainty what's going to happen. I think we all know that COVID-19 has kind of put a wrinkle into, what were the plans. Well, I can tell you with certainty they are going to reconvene next week. Right now, it appears that the House will focus on COVID-19 related elections legislation, from what I'm hearing, while the Senate looks like they'll be working on some pending and possibly here on unemployment benefits. So a lot of their work is still related to identifying what are the needs related to COVID-19 and how to go forth going forward. Currently, the legislature is kind of in a somewhat of a holding pattern, if you will, regarding if they're going to take additional COVID-related measures. Right now, they're awaiting determination from the feds on whether they can use an additional $2 billion that we received as a state from the CARES Act, whether we can use that to support our state budget. And so, as you can imagine, there are many concerned about the loss of revenue associated with the pandemic. There are some at the legislature that have had estimates of a substantial revenue shortfall, roughly $3 to $4 billion is what we're looking at. And so compared to our current state budget of $24 billion, that's about a 12 to 16% of the current state budget. And so that's quite a hit. So really, it's anyone's guess as to when the legislature is expected to take up non-COVID legislation. As for when lawmakers will make adjustments to the biennial budget, there have been rumblings that could be as late as July or August. Obviously, we would have already started the fiscal year at that point. As Deputy Secretary Laster alluded to, by shifting the state's income tax filing deadline from April to July, it won't be known for quite some time as to how much income tax is collected. And so that typical of that April surprise will now be a July surprise. We'll see how it all turns out, but it's definitely unprecedented times. So now I'd like to, now that I've kind of gone over what's been going on at the General Assembly and how it's been really heavily involved with COVID-19, relief measures, I'd like to transition into the bills of interest that were carried over from the long session. There are 4 bills that I briefly will go over. All of these you've heard of before, but just want to kind of give you a where they stand update. So House Bill 702, Modified Juvenile Crime Prevention Councils, that includes the JJAC recommendations for JCPC-related special provisions. That was, of course, passed in the House last session. Right now, it currently resides in the Senate Rules Committee, and we're going to do everything we can here in the short session once things kind of get back to some sense of normalcy to advocate to have that bill passed on the Senate side. So hopefully we'll see those moving through. House Bill 347, Study No Delinquent Undisciplined Under 10. This bill directs the JJAC to study modifying the definitions of delinquent and undisciplined juveniles to include only juveniles who are at least 10 years of age. That's been sitting in Senate rules since last May. Now, as many of you know, the JJAC was proactive and went ahead and established the minimum age subcommittee, and their work continues. And so I think it's good that the JJAC went ahead and was proactive, and it's definitely whether this legislation passes or not, it's an issue that this committee, has the experts in the field convene together and can look at the issue to know if it is a good idea and what that age, what makes sense for that age to be. Senate Bill 419 is a technical and other changes bill. It, among many things, would clarify that any person under the age of 18 that's ordered to be confined must be housed in a division of adult correction and juvenile justice juvenile detention facility or in an approved local confinement facility that's been approved by the Division of Juvenile Justice. It also would clarify that juvenile justice personnel would be responsible for transporting persons under the age of 18 to and from juvenile detention facilities and approved local confinement facilities. And finally, the bill would prohibit holding persons under the age of 18 in a county confinement facility unless an agreement exists between that facility and the Division of Juvenile Justice. And so this language was proposed back in the fall by the Sheriff's Association. It's supported by the Division of Juvenile Justice. This will help our state be in line with the Juvenile Justice Delinquency Prevention Act. I believe it's 2021 when those requirements are that no one under the age of 18 should be in those jails. So that'll be something that the division has supported. That bill has passed the House, and because it was a Senate bill, it passed the Senate, it went to the House, it was changed, the House passed it, now it's been sent back to the Senate. And so now it's currently sitting in Senate rules. So where it will go, we'll see once things get back to normal. Senate Bill 562 is the last one on my list. That's the Second Chance Act. This bill would revise various expunction laws, including those related to juvenile records. This would allow for the expunction of certain offenses committed prior to December 1st, 2019, which was the raise the age date, for individuals who were 16 or 17 years old at the age of the time of offense. These offenses include misdemeanors and Class H or I felonies that could be expunged unless they were offenses involving impaired driving or an offense requiring registration as a sex offender. That bill passed the Senate last May, and the bill has not been acted upon since August 2019, where it currently sits in House rules. So in closing, the Legislative Revisions and Legal Issues Subcommittee, as Deputy Secretary Laster had mentioned, they had several items that were discussed at their January meeting. I won't get into all those details since Heather Tarasca is about to provide a committee update, but I'm confident that if there are legislative changes needed, we'll be able to find an appropriate vehicle to insert the language into. So I do think that, if there are necessary changes, everyone knew coming into this that it would be a matter of time before, certain revisions were necessary. We had to get into things first to really understand what changes needed to occur. And so with all that being said, that concludes my update, and I'd be happy to take any questions at this time. I appreciate your attention.
Okay, thank you, Justin. Any questions of anyone of Justin? Okay, hearing none, we'll move on to the Legislative and Legal Issues Recommendation Update. Heather?
Good morning. We met on January 31st, and we spent just developing a list of issues that we're going to need to work on moving forward. I'm just going to go through the list. I'm not going to go into great detail about each of the items, so let me know if you have any questions. At the very end of our meeting, Juvenile Justice indicated that they were going to work on proposed language for these bullets, giving Superior Court judges authority to close court for juvenile cases, giving legal assistance access to the case management system Cypress, language for defining exactly what the indictment process involves. There's nothing in the law that allows indictments to be returned to district court. Criminal procedure dictates that they should be returned to Superior Court. Also, there are issues regarding confidentiality, and Juvenile Justice indicated that they would try to develop some language that we could discuss at our next meeting. Also, maximum YBC commitment language and conforming amendments regarding jurisdictional limitations that didn't account for the raise the age legislation but need to now. They indicated that they were going to try and develop some language around that as well, which we'll discuss at our next meeting. Other topics that we that came out data before January 15th to work on or How are pretrial release conditions going to be set once the transfer order is entered? There is nothing in the statute that dictates exactly what the process should be for that. Another issue that came out of that report, if a case is returned to juvenile court via reverse waiver, should a secure custody order issue if the juvenile is in custody? Another item was, what are the notice requirements for transfers to superior court? Is it that it's unclear what type of notice the statute requires? It could be interpreted as notice that an indictment has been returned, or it could mean notice of the intent to transfer. And we need to make a recommendation surrounding what the language should be so that there's a clear understanding of what's required. And finally, the last item that came out of the report is whether or not a transfer hearing is required for transfer. The statute 70-20-200.5A doesn't specifically refer to hearing, and we need to clarify that as well. That's everything that came out of the report, as well as items that the juvenile justice folks indicated that they would work on. We also did compile other items that we want to discuss at our upcoming meetings. These submissions were what happens if juveniles fail to appear in superior court or otherwise violate conditions of release. Should an order for arrest enter? Also, appeal of transfer decisions. We need to make it clear what the parameters are surrounding when and how you can appeal. Whether prayer for judgments continued or conditional discharges count as convictions. That is not, we don't have consistent application across the state as to how folks are viewing those. We also talked about coming up with a gang enhancement hearing process, language surrounding that. We talked about video conferencing as pre-COVID, and now we may be able to remove that from our list since we're already there. Law enforcement discretion was another topic. There's no clear statutory guidance on who is responsible for determining that a juvenile must be charged as an adult due to prior convictions. DPS has adopted a policy that encourages law enforcement to consult a court counselor before processing a juvenile as an adult, but that there's not a requirement. Other items, putting felony Chapter 20 motor vehicle offenses under the jurisdiction of juvenile court. There's some issues regarding protective order regulations under Chapter 50B. The statute requires that individuals who violate domestic protective orders shall be arrested and taken into custody, which is not congruent with the language that surrounds secure custody order regulations in the juvenile code. So we want to make that consistent. Case law for emancipated youth, how does that impact juvenile court jurisdiction? That was another item. Mary Stansel submitted via email an item after we met on January the 31st that expunction time for petitions that have been dismissed says a delinquent who has attained the age of 16 needs to be changed to 18, and that's under 7B 3200H. Also got a submission from Jackie Green around juvenile sex offender registration. The termination statute it sets that the registration terminates on the 18th birthday of the juvenile, and we need to make a conforming amendment for the raise the age legislation. Also in my notes, and maybe someone can help me remember, were something about voting while impaired and malicious conduct by prisoners. I didn't have anything more written about those, but that is the list that I've compiled. I've tried to document everything that we discussed along the way so that we have a running list. Also, as I indicated, if folks send me items via email, I put them on the master list so that we have everything in one place that we do need to tackle. If there's any other items that folks want to suggest, you can send me an email. If there is anything that I missed from the committee standpoint, you have to add now. I appreciate that. So again, I have all the material in one spot, but that's what we discussed. Just again, making this list so that we could work on these items moving forward. We do need to schedule a meeting. I'm waiting until we have this meeting today to do that, but that would be the next step, is coming up with a time where we can meet probably via WebEx so that we can begin to work on the items on this list. But that's all I have.
Okay, Heather, thank you for that. The next meeting that you need to schedule, you probably need to schedule that through Kim, I guess?
Yes, I'll work with Kim, and if this time and day of the week seems to work for folks, we'll try for another Friday morning.
Okay, that sounds good. Any questions of Heather? Okay, hearing none, then we'll move on. Thank you, Heather, and thank you for your committee's work and for your work. It's a very, very important task, but a very difficult task. Okay, moving on to the problematic sexual behavior. Ms. Johnson with the Child Treatment Program.
Good morning, everybody, and thank you for having me join you today. I hope everybody can hear me.
We can.
Okay, great. And you should be able to see my slideshow at this point. So again, my name is Nikki Croteau Johnson. I am a psychologist and also the clinical director for the Problematic Sexual Behavior Program through the North Carolina Child Treatment Program. Just a quick bit about me. I have spent the bulk of my career, my clinical career, in New Hanover County, working with juvenile justice and foster care populations, particularly around problematic sexual behavior, trauma, sexual abuse, and those types of issues within that population, including as the licensed mental health clinician attached to New Hanover Juvenile Detention Center for many years. So in recognition of time, I might have to go a little faster through my slides, but you guys do have the slides. I believe Ms. Quinta sent those ahead of time. And again, as we move forward, if there's questions or if folks want to get some more information, we can be in contact later. So some of you may be familiar with the North Carolina Child Treatment Program. I just wanted to provide a little bit of context. We were established in 2006 to support sustainable statewide dissemination of child mental health EBTs. And we do typically use a learning collaborative style, which is somewhere, depending on the model, it's about 12 to 18 months long that clinicians are involved in. During that time, they are taking training cases and receiving intensive one-to-one consultation with a clinical expert. We do have fairly high fidelity standards within the North Carolina Child Treatment Program. And what that means is that during the consultation calls, there are continually checking the clinician's adherence to the model, whether they're collecting data, the performance metrics, et cetera. So we do actually have some clinicians that do not graduate or meet our standards for certification. And so we typically highlight that we tend to have higher fidelity standards than some of the other programs across the country that do roster clinicians. As far as rostering, we do have a roster that is located under www.ncchildtreatmentprogram.org. Anyone can go to that website and you can search by the evidence-based treatment modality. You can search by county or name, and you can see who is certified in a particular EBT in North Carolina if they have been trained through our program. We did recognize early on that training clinicians, although they were very excited to be trained and did really well during trainings, one of the things we discovered early on was that if we did not have buy-in from decision makers or agency administrators, it was very difficult to sustain the program in particular agencies. So an implementation track has been added across the EBTs. For those familiar, you may have heard it as a senior leader track. We are also funded by the North Carolina General Assembly through an annual recurring appropriation, and we are contracted by and collaborate with NCDMH. Since 2013, we have expanded to include 5 evidence-based treatments for children birth through 18. I'm not going to go into them in detail in the interest of time. Most of you will be familiar with trauma-focused CBT or TFCBT. We also do parent and child interaction therapy or PCIT, child-parent psychotherapy or CPP, the structured psychotherapy for adolescents responding to chronic stress or SPARCS. SPARCS and TFCBT, we've been successful in training many clinicians within the YDCs and other juvenile justice areas, so you may be most familiar with those particular programs. The program I'll be talking about today is our newest EBT, which is problematic sexual behavior, cognitive behavior therapy. So I'm briefly just going to go over what is problematic sexual behavior in children and youth, and you'll hear it called PSB or problematic sexual behavior. It is child-initiated behaviors that involve private parts, so the genitals, anus, buttocks, and or breasts, could involve other body parts, mouth, hands, etc. The focus is on the behavior. Here, when we're talking about child problematic sexual behavior, and although the term sexual is utilized, I want to highlight that the intentions and motivations for these behaviors may be unrelated to sexual gratification in children and youth. This is distinctly different from the way that we view adult sex offenders. We know now from a lot of research that the child and the adolescent brain is not fully developed until somewhere in the 21 to 24 year age range, and so there's a whole different host of things that we need to consider when we're looking at children and youth who display problematic sexual behavior. So children and youth do exhibit a wide range of developmentally typical sexual behaviors involving self and others, so it's very important to be able to distinguish between what is normal sex play or what is normal developmentally appropriate sexual behavior versus problematic sexual behavior. And this just gives you a brief list of what we consider becomes problematic when it causes harm or potential harm to self or others, when it occurs frequently, when it's not responding to caregiver intervention, when the behavior occurs mostly in response to negative emotional states such as anxiety, shame, fear, or anger, if it occurs between children of vastly different ages or abilities. In other words, if a 12-year-old who might have some developmental disabilities and have a lower IQ with an 11-year-old who is developmentally higher in their understanding than that particular child. So that, again, is, would be problematic when you're looking at abilities. And the last is, of course, becomes problematic when it's aggressive and or coercive in nature. This particular chart I won't go over in detail, but it just gives you some general guidelines for determining when sexual behaviors become a problem. Incidentally, you could use this particular chart to help determine other behaviors when they start to move into that problematic realm as well for children and adolescents. So when looking across the top, you'll see frequency. So that's a high frequency. The kids are not involved in normal childhood activities because they're so involved in the sexualized behavior, and it's unresponsive. Again, the developmental considerations that I just talked about, and the level of harm. I'll talk a little bit now about the origins of PSB, or where we, what we believe happens when children develop problematic sexual behavior. I believe the historical assumption from most folks is that all children with sexual behavior problems have been sexually abused. That's typically the first thought on a parent's mind, on anybody's mind when they learn about a child engaging in problematic sexual behavior. What we know from the data is that that's actually not true. Not all children who engage in problematic sexual behavior have a sexual abuse history. You'll see here the percentages depending on the samples or where the data is collected from. It can be anywhere between 4 and 98%. We do know that sexual abuse may be more likely in female children with problematic sexual behavior. And frankly, we know that most children who have been sexually abused do not engage in problematic sexual behavior. The data shows that of substantiated child sexual abuse cases, somewhere in the 36% range of preschool age children develop some problematic sexual behavior, and around 6% of school age children engage in problematic sexual behavior. This particular chart was adapted from Friedrich and Davis in 2003, and basically what it shows is sort of the overlapping circles of ways that problematic sexual behavior can develop in children. So if you see at the top child vulnerabilities, and this will be familiar with many of you as you're working with juvenile justice involved populations. So child vulnerabilities including behavior problems, developmental or verbal delays, just general impulse control problems. Those overlapping with family adversity, so factors that hinder parental guidance and supervision. A lot of these times these children are not supervised in the home for whatever reason, for the parents are working, and that's just, they have to take care of themselves because of poverty or other issues, or the parents are substance abusing, those types of things. Another area where we see children developing problematic sexual behavior from is what's called the modeling of coercion. So being exposed to physical abuse, domestic violence, general community violence, peer violence, and harsh parenting practices. And lastly, the modeling of sexuality. And so that could be related to direct sexual abuse of the child, or simply by, if you look at having a kid at home that has no supervision and access to media. We all know the amount of pornographic materials that are easily accessed through media, and a lot of times kids unintentionally expose themselves to pornographic material, and without supervision and proper parental guidance, just become really curious, and then choose to act out some of those things that they may have seen online or in person. We do know that problematic sexual behavior usually occurs when the kid feels anxious or angry. They may be reacting to trauma. They may be overly curious about, after being exposed to sexual material, as I mentioned, they might be seeking attention or trying to imitate others, or using it as a self-soothing mechanism. In general, we do notice that children with problematic sexual behaviors typically have very low impulse control, poor social skills, and general poor decision-making ability. This slide is particularly important. I will say anecdotally, when I started out doing this work 20 years ago, most of our, the way that we treated children that engaged in problematic sexual behavior was based on adult sex offender principles and those models. And so we now know that that was not the correct way to be treating children and adolescents with this, but 20 years ago, that's the best that we had. So we've moved forward greatly. What we do know about youth, and this is through adolescence, when we compare them to adult sex offenders, is that they tend to have fewer victims and behaviors. It's a shorter duration of behavior as well. They also tend to engage in fewer behaviors that involve penetrative acts. And they also have different motivations for their behavior. As I mentioned before, it's not usually as a result of sexual fantasies or things like that. It's more experimental or curiosity-driven behaviors. So in that sense, they're less specific focused sexual behaviors. We have less evidence of sexual compulsivity. If folks are familiar with the adult sex offender principles, we would ask them about the abuse cycle, the offense cycle, their grooming patterns, those types of things, and other features found in adults. And we really don't have any evidence that that actually occurs in children and adolescents in the same way. And finally, there's no evidence that these kids and youth have a lifelong incurable sexual disorder or a paraphilia. In regards to prevalence rates, unfortunately, we don't have solid prevalence rates across the country, as there's no research or accurate data on the prevalence or incidence of problematic sexual behavior in children. The data that we do have is gathered from multiple sources, from federal data, from local data, from victim data. We do know that somewhere around greater than 1/3 of sexual offenses against child victims are initiated and committed by other youth. We also know that problematic sexual behavior primarily occurs with other children known by the youth, with somewhere around a quarter of the victims being family members. And a few sexual offenses of youth involve strangers, which mimics some of the actual adult sex offender literature, where it's not necessarily stranger danger, it's those folks that you know, it's the peers that the children are around most of the time. Here you'll see some prevalence data that's specific to North Carolina. This is from the period ending December 2016. You guys may have more updated data at this point, but there were somewhere around 4,500 minors that were adjudicated for sexual offenses in that 10-year period in December 2016. Those adjudicated children were between the ages of 6 and 16, with approximately 1/3 under 13, and the vast majority of them were male. When we look at data from the North Carolina Child Advocacy Centers, their data from 2015 suggests around 16.4% of the sexual abuse cases that came into their centers involved a perpetrator under the age of 18. I will say that anecdotally, I've been in phone calls with child advocacy centers across North Carolina over the past 6 to 9 months, and they are reporting numbers closer to the 30 to 40% range. And as a note, these kids would probably not be known to the juvenile justice system, and so that's something important to consider as we move forward to try to identify and prevent problematic sexual behavior. So in recognition of the fact that PSB exists in children and youth, many of those of you on the call have known that this has been an issue for many, many, many years. But the North Carolina Child Treatment Program a couple of years ago took this mantle up and said, hey, what can we do to try to create a platform, an evidence-based treatment that we can train the clinical workforce around PSB. So to that end, they engaged in a 2-year-long exploratory process, which involved convening a clinical consensus panel, conducting key informant interviews, an exhaustive research looking at all available PSB models, and the findings of research were explored with experts across the state, across the nation, and actually some international experts as well were consulted. The final conclusion of this exploratory process, the experts recommended a statewide dissemination of problematic sexual behavior, cognitive behavior therapy, which I'll explain in more detail shortly. They also recommended support of other models that are already being used in the state, MST-PSB, which is multisystemic therapy with an add-on that's specific to problematic sexual behavior. The TASK program, which is, I believe, out in the western part of the state with Children's Hope Alliance, and there may be some others within the state. So the supporting evidence, what really drove most of the experts to recommend PSB-CBT was that the majority of children and youth who have participated in this particular model cease to engage in PSB. The recidivism rate in school-age children is around 2% at 10-year follow-up, which is amazing. We rarely get a recidivism rate that low. They also showed significant improvement in non-sexual behavior problems, emotional difficulties, and trauma symptoms. And we also get a decrease in parenting stress and an increase in parenting skills. Associated outcomes, I thought this would be beneficial for you folks to look at as well, is that most of these children and youth can benefit from outpatient PSB CBT, so that avoids that cost and disruption associated with the out-of-home placement. And you can see here that Jean Steinberg, before she left her post earlier this year, shared this information with me, that the approximate annual cost for placement in a North Carolina PRTF or psychiatric residential treatment facility or juvenile justice facility are greater than $50,000 and $100,000 respectively. And we know we can provide treatment for way less than that in the community. So getting into the actual model, it was originally developed by folks out of the University of Oklahoma Health Sciences Center and the University of Washington. It's since been revised by Jane Solosky and others at Oklahoma. Our current program is currently in training with Oklahoma at this time. I'll explain our pre-COVID and post-COVID issues we've had. The gold standard for this particular therapy model is the group treatment model, and it is broken out across ages. There's a preschool model, a school-age model, and adolescent model. We are currently training in the school-age model, which is the 7 to 12-year-old range, and we will begin recruiting for the adolescent model this fall. There is an individual and family adaptation available as well. PSB is designed to address a wide range of problematic sexual behavior, failure to recognize socially acceptable physical boundaries, excessive masturbation, preoccupation with pornography and other sexualized content, generation and or dissemination of sexualized images of self or others, and then the coercive and or aggressive sexual acts. So for a little bit more detail in regards to the school age model, it is for 7 to 12-year-olds. It is a CBT based model and a socio-ecological approach. It is somewhere between 16 and 18 weekly sessions that last 60 to 90 minutes. The key is the caregiver involvement. For the group model, we have concurrent caregiver and child groups running, or that was the intent pre-COVID. Post-COVID, we have had to actually shift during our training to delivering the family model, and we are I am successfully, a couple of us are successfully delivering it virtually, albeit with some difficulty, but it is actually working out. The family adaptation is similar in duration and caregiver involvement. These are the treatment goals, or the areas that we work on during treatment. So obviously the first one is related to public safety. So let's eliminate or reduce the problematic sexual behaviors altogether. Improving the coping skills and self-control strategies, enhancing social competence skills, et cetera, improving caregiver monitoring and supervision. This is just a brief slide that lets you know that there's been quite a bit of research done, or meta-analysis of all the existing treatments that exist for problematic sexual behavior and the practice elements that have been shown to be most effective. So if you're going to use an evidence-based treatment for children and youth with PSB, these are the practice elements that should be included. So behavior parent training was the most significant practice element, and basically that's just helping the parents learn how to manage behavior, proper supervision, and things like that. The BPT did overlap with other practice elements, particularly teaching rules about sexual behavior and boundaries, sex education, and abuse prevention skills. The child practice element that's been shown to be most effective within these programs is the impulse control skills. Practice elements that were evolved from the adult sex offenders treatments were actually not significant predictors of success through treatment. I wanted to let you know that this map shows you what our current problematic sexual behavior CBT training teams are. I recruited 6 teams from across the state to start for our pilot program. And so you can see those clearly shown here. There's the Center for Child and Family Health, who I'm associated with for Durham and Orange. We have Triangle Family Services in Wake, Carousel Center in Coastal in the coastal area. I paired them because the Carousel Center is the child advocacy center in the area. Coastal Horizons, a fairly large mental health service agency. And so my intention there was, as we move through and develop clinical workforce across the different models, that some of these areas would be able to be sort of centers of excellence and be able to provide treatment across the age group, so from age 3 to 18 across the models. Let's see. So for next steps, we will continue delivering treatment for the PSB CBT school age model, albeit virtually right now. We will start recruiting agencies for the adolescent model this fall, and we hope to begin training in the spring of 2021 and thus delivering treatment shortly thereafter. The training in PSB CBT, the preschool model, will follow in subsequent years. The ultimate goal is to develop trainer capacity within North Carolina so that we can take over and begin to train and develop the clinical workforce around PSB CBT. We are also interested in creating state and community level PSB advisory boards. While we would like to do a state level board, we also recognize that the community really knows what's going on in their own community, and so it's very important to have those advisory boards and get MDTs on board, et cetera. And the last slide I won't spend a lot of time on is just really our sort of overarching model for how we are hoping to develop and sustain the PSB CBT capacity. So really looking at the referral base, where are these referrals coming from? If they're school referrals, if they're from the community, et cetera. One of the other things that I wanted to mention is that this is very heavily assessment driven. Children are put through a fairly extensive trauma-informed clinical assessment that would inform whether PSB treatment is the appropriate treatment protocol or if another EBT is more appropriate based on assessment. And then that we have that system of care collaboration. So I will stop sharing my screen and be available for any questions. I'm aware I may have gone over my time, so. And I hope I didn't talk
too fast.
You're fine.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson. Okay, does anybody have any questions of Ms. Johnson? Okay, hearing no questions, then we will, again, thank you, Ms. Johnson, for that presentation. That's a very difficult population, and a lot of good work has to go into that.
Thank you.
Next on our agenda is any new business. Do we have any new business from any of our members?
I was going to ask if any of the other committees might try to meet over the next few months, or maybe we're just waiting for, more lifting of restrictions. But I was wondering specifically about the minimum age committee, whether it meet again in the near future.
Kim, this is Jake Orping. Yes, absolutely. We're gonna meet again, hopefully within the next 30 days. I'm just trying to dig out from under a COVID task force a little bit, and then we'll get scheduled back.
Okay, thank you.
Deputy Secretary Lassiter, anything from Housing Expansion Subcommittee?
Yeah, we're trying to get OJJDC to come down to the federal office of juvenile justice to come down and give us a presentation on exactly what the requirements of new juvenile justice delinquency prevention act was. We had them scheduled to come, and then COVID hit, so we're trying to work with them to see if we can work out a time for them to either do it virtually or if there's a way for them to still come and do it. So as soon as we work out some of the details with the federal office, we'll get up with the housing committee and let you guys know when that's going to be. But we hope to do it relatively soon.
Thank you, Dave. Any other new business? Okay, Kim, did we have any public comments that's been submitted so far, or are those for after the meeting?
So we've received nothing directly, but comments that flow through the online form will be sent out to everyone at the conclusion of the meeting for response as appropriate.
Okay. Thank you for that.
Yes, sir.
Any other new business? Anyone? If not, next steps. Co-Chair Franks, anything that you'd like to share?
No, sir, I have nothing for the group at this point.
Okay. Thank you very much. Thanks to the department and to Kim for setting up this meeting for us, and I think it's been very successful. Hope everybody's been able to hear well and that everybody's been able to participate at the level that they're comfortable with. Hope everybody stays safe and stay healthy. And our next meeting should be the meeting in August the 28th. We probably don't know yet if we're going to be able to meet in person or not, but we'll be able to have a meeting at that time, hopefully, and also be looking for the subcommittees and the scheduling of those meetings, and making sure that everybody that wants to participate in those can do that. Is there anything else anybody has? If not, then I'll go ahead and we'll adjourn our meeting. Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye, y'all.